Hello, everyone, and welcome to our VAC Roundtable number 89. This one is we're going to we usually have interviews with folk, but that's not going to be the case today. We're kind of just going to be talking ourselves. And what we're basically want to engage you is specifically on a piece of legislation that one of our members helped craft with the VA way back in the day. And it is specifically dealing with VHA Directive 1315. And this one is one a lot of people know of, but they don't specifically know what it is. And that in itself has brought us a series of challenges to understand on why you should be able to discuss cannabis with your physician at the VA hospital. Originally, that was not the case. I'm a Gulf War veteran, and I sustained injuries during combat. Was sent home due to those injuries. And when I would talk to the VA about my medical cannabis, they would physically call security and have me removed from the VA facilities. This was in the mid '90s. And it's unfortunately happened to me and other veterans. And fortunately, one of our friends of the VAC and one of our founders, Michael Crowitz, said enough of that and helped push the VA behind the scenes to craft this specific directive so that doctors can understand that you should be able to discuss cannabis with your VA patients and them not lose their benefits. So, way prior to 2010, Michael Crowitz worked along with the VA to help make this a reality. And that's going to lead us into our first question, which is what is the behind the scenes history of the VA cannabis policy? And what and where are the key documents, such as the VA policy evolution, the VA policy itself, cannabis info page, PTSD info page, and cancer page? I'm not sure what that means. So, Michael Crowitz.
Yeah, sorry about that. Cancer page, actually, I couldn't find what I thought I was looking for was actually, I think, the American, what is it, National Institutes of Health Cancer Research Center or whatever, not the VA, for compare and contrast. And to compare and contrast, it is rather interesting. We'll be talking about in a second the information page for post-traumatic stress that they have on the website of the VA. And if you were to compare and contrast that with the above aforementioned cancer information that you'd find at the American Cancer Society or National Institutes of Health Cancer Research Center, whatever, you'll find a stark difference because all this stuff that we know. I mean, before we even get started with anything related to this question or anything, just cannabis, just know that we've got an enormous amount of research that we're looking at. It's not, a few documents. It's not even a few books. It's dozens and dozens of books based on 10,000 or so documents. And many of those documents are peer reviewed, important studies or peer reviewed, uh, what do you call them? Where you do documentation review and evidentiary review and different kinds of journal articles essentially. Um, a lot of them based on actual real world experience and a lot of them based on not so real world experience. And I think that's one of the things that you have to take into consideration before you even get started on any of this is that uh, if you're talking about a rat study or some cell study, you can't necessarily extrapolate that to human beings. And even if there's a small group of human beings that respond well to something, that's why they then do a larger study and look at more human beings to make sure that it wasn't just an anomaly. And I think that's, in a nutshell, what the best takeaway is from the FDA systems and all that is to remove anomalies and get us on the same page based on evidence. So anyway, starting at that point, I think going back, people, I think would benefit a little bit from the history of the cannabis policy at the VA for two reasons. One, to see how many little bits and pieces kind of go together to have something like this actually happen. And the second, to show that you can actually, have an impact, that your work and your um, efforts are not in vain. That little tiny efforts add up, and that in the end, you can really, make a difference. So before I get into that, I want people to know takeaways from this, video. If you're looking at this in a future date, hopefully you'll understand this VA policy a little better, which will help you basically apply it better, basically help you understand it so that you can actually use it in your life and see how it applies to you, if it applies to you. Um, Definitely, there's some key things that we're going to actually read from the VA's webpage that should make veterans feel more at ease if they're using cannabis for medicine. Um, and understand that, if there is a problem, how to seek help for that problem, and some of the foibles, and we'll talk about some of the things that the VA does that isn't correct, and that you might get caught up in to prevent you from falling into that pitfall. So sorry to go up on a soapbox there for a while, but get back to the questions of behind the scenes history of the VA cannabis policy. So I actually started out, I'd say around 10 years earlier, without looking at a calendar. I'm terrible with dates, but it was right about 10 years earlier. So looking at right around 2000. 1996, we of course successfully, ATN and I working side by side from miles and miles away without even knowing each other really at the time, working on the same thing, Proposition 215 in California, a landmark medical cannabis initiative, uh, setting the stage for really the modern cannabis movement as we know it now. That initiative, once it passed, and even before it passed, one of our mentors, again, collectively, both Etienne and I, and Mary Lynn on the call as well, all three of us call as a mentor Dr. Todd McArea, renowned uh, uh, psychiatrist working in cannabis field, um, renowned before he even started cannabis in no nukes and fighting against nuclear proliferation. Really an amazing individual. And his work before Proposition 215 even was passed showed us an enormous potential for cannabis. Because what he did that was different was when a patient came in and said, "Hey, I use cannabis, it helps me." He did a thorough review of the patient and all the dotted I's and crossed T's like any other doctor would and should. But he also took the time to go into the diagnostic manual and figure out exactly what these people were actually suffering from, and then make notes about how those symptoms or those problems were actually being alleviated by the cannabis. And I forget the exact number that he came up with, but he had somewhere close to 10,000 patients by the time 2000 rolled around when I started this project. And in that patient field, if you will, more than half of those patients were using cannabis for some sort of painful condition, and more than half of those people were using cannabis as some sort of an adjunct treatment. In other words, a significant portion were able to use cannabis and put aside pharmaceuticals, and that's great. We love that in the cannabis movement, but we have to recognize that a significant portion of folks that have serious, long-term symptoms that find relief from cannabis still wind up using some of the pharmaceutical drugs as well. And that bit of information together with something that I learned inside the drug policy reform movement that was just sort of coalescing at the time around such people as like Dr. Ethan Nadelman, Professor Nadelman, and his cohorts there in New York, and Washington D.C. They set up a Linda Smith Center, and they started looking into harm reduction and all these different concepts around drug policy reform, and just like drug policy reform 101 was all this increased budget and funding and spending on incarcerating people and policing and stuff. Tiny, tiny, tiny little budget on education and rehabilitation, drug treatment, whatever. 90, percent kind of percentiles going to interdiction. And with that kind of increasing drug war that I was learning about with Ethan and the facts as I knew them on the ground with the medical cannabis, kind of community out there, I saw what I thought to be two freight trains that were about to collide, that were heading straight for each other. And one freight train was the increased use of cannabis as a medicine. And Prop 215 was heralding in, this new time frame up, and I think by 2000 it was pretty obvious that that was really heavy. It was spreading really like wildfire across the country. These new medical marijuana laws. Um, yeah. Uh, if more and more people are going to be using cannabis as a medicine, and if they're still using some sort of treatment from the doctor, what's the chance of that colliding with the doctor then feeling beholden to police out their patients and kick patients out of their treatment because they uh, tested positive on a drug screening, a urine test, or something like that? And in fact, at that time, around 2000, I found something emerging and circulating. Not sure where it ever initially came from. It was called a pain contract. And these documents were never really created by any big medical society. I looked at the American Academies of Pain Management and the American Medical Association, and those folks had copies of it available for their membership. If you read carefully their documentation, they did not recommend the use of these things, but they did have them there for their membership, and they were spreading like wildfire. Our ally, good friend Dale Geringer out in California went to a seminar, a conference, where they actually were being told by like an MD-JD speaker that they needed to drug test their patients and that they needed to kick them out of treatment if they tested positive for any illegal drugs, and they needed to get their patients all signing these pain contracts to cover their, what, for insurance reasons and for, criminal liability. I don't believe any of that's true. I think that's all MD, fantasy. But nonetheless, that's what they're being told. And I think to this day, they're still getting that echo of that same instruction. And there are still, even as we're speaking, more doctors than not out there drug testing their patients and kicking them out of treatment should they drug test positive for illegal drugs. Um, this story and this policy at the VA took a big chunk out of that, but it still actually exists and it's still a pervasive problem, especially for folks like in controlled environments like old folks' homes and veterans' homes and prisons and stuff like that. So, but anyway, back to the story. So I'm ready to fight this thing. I was part of a group. We were fighting against drug testing, generally urine testing, and there was a urine testing national organization and everything fighting against urine. I can't remember. Maybe you remember it in the name of the organization, but it was an organization fighting against urine testing at the national level, and it was very small, crowd. There wasn't very many organizations or anything really working on that. Unfortunately, even though I think that was a really big issue, fighting drug testing, especially it was creeping, if you remember, into schools and athletics and all kinds of places that they were implementing these drug testing. Not ever based on evidence. They never had real evidence showing that it would lower the drug use or have any kind of positive outcome. No, just drug testing because we need to be hard on drugs. And I started fighting that out in the field, if you will, out in the real regular world, and found myself very quickly realizing that I wasn't going to be able to get anywhere very fast because if I had it published somewhere, published these ideas somewhere and sort of spread that way, it was a really uphill battle. If ever you succeed at that. If I try to change doctors' behavior, it's almost a one by one thing, unless you can get the medical boards to change, and they're not going to change if they have no real reason to from the medical societies. The medical societies aren't going to change. Sort of a catch-22 there, unless the medical boards do. Um, I thought, hey, if I go into the VA and inside the Department of Veterans Affairs hospital system, and I fought that there, I could apply all these constitutional principles. I thought, you have a right to be secure in your person and, not be subject to inappropriate searches and seizures. You have a right to free speech. You have a right to, all these essential rights that I thought were being violated by drug testing. Certainly, if we can fight it inside the VA, in that hospital setting, when they inevitably hand me a pain contract or hand one of our allies a pain contract to sign and demand that they sign it, maybe that's how we can fight it. We can fight it, because the VA, being a federal government entity, has to follow the Constitution. Well, I finally, I guess it wasn't really, I don't remember it being all that long after that thought process that I was actually handed that document at the VA. And you want to see a really stunned medical staff it wasn't the doctor that handed it to me, it was the nurse as we were, checking out there at the desk, and she hands me this thing and says, the doctor wants you to sign this. Oh, in my hand, she drops a pain contract. And since it said contract, literally said contract on the document, I told her that the truth, actually, I promised my dad a long, long, long time ago I would never sign any contract without running it by our lawyer, showing it to lawyer first. And when I asked the nurse so I could take this piece of paper with me to show it to the family attorney, oh man, I thought she was going to have some sort of panic attack. She asked the doctor and they discussed it, went into a huddle, and they're like, they couldn't think of a reason to stop me from leaving their office with that document. So here, I got the document. I made copies of it. I did show it to my attorney, a regular a lawyer that, does the paperwork for your house real estate contracts and
Yeah.
stuff, regular family attorney. Does some criminal defense, in town.
Yeah.
And bless you. And I asked the attorney um, about this document. I showed it to him. I explained the situation, and he said, "Well, this isn't a contract per se." And this is funny. I guess I learned, a little bit of contract 101, contract law. Bless you. But yeah, if you don't get anything, if you just give something and you don't get anything per se in return, that's not a contract. I've always known, and you probably have too seen this, where you paid $1 to somebody and you got a house or something like that. Well, that makes sense because they have to get something. That dollar, while it seems silly, is actually something they get on their ledger side of the contract, and then you get the house or whatever. It actually works out. It's a contract. What they were doing was telling me under duress, if I didn't sign this quote contract, I would lose my treatment that I was already getting. This wasn't anything that I was getting. They were going to take something away from me if I didn't sign it. That's under duress. It's not a contract because I'm not actually getting anything new. And he sort of shot down the whole thing basically just on its face. And I went back to them and I told them that. And I said that I can't sign this, that, this entire thing is defunct. I explained this whole situation. And it created a conundrum for them. It really did. Here was a veteran. I guess most of the time that they had trouble with these kind of things at the VA hospital, it was a veteran that signed it and then quote unquote failed the drug test. Right? I don't know of anybody that actually did what I did and refused to sign it and then just stood there and said, "Well, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do about it? I'm not going to sign this. What are you going to do about it? I'm still in pain. Not signing this did not lower my pain for the day. I'm still, same vet you were treating yesterday. Are you going to change my treatment based on me not signing this?" And that was this sort of standoff that I created with the VA. I went through the chain of command. being that I started with the management of that VA facility, went up to the VISN level, which was still in the same facility, but I was seeing a lady sitting across from a desk from a lady that was seeing 10,000 patients or something like that. It's not insignificant numbers. And then the next people that I talked to, they were dealing with the entire country. It went, basically from there to DC. I found my way to two things in Washington, D.C. The ethics committee of the VA, and you know, ethically, it's just undefensible. You can't take away someone's treatment because they won't sign a contract. It's just on its face quite indefensible. Again, a conundrum. I presented a conundrum for them. And the other aspect of the national VA that I found was this pain management directorate that exists inside of the Undersecretary for Health office inside the VA. Health administration. I know I'm throwing out a lot of words, but all those words will help you find this thing if you're trying to look through the web pages of the federal government, the labyrinth of the federal government. Um, I actually got to the point where I was, sort of negotiating, if you will, this process on its face and dealing with it on its face. But I had, some cards, if you will, up my sleeve that give me the ability to play in a unconventional way. So the first aspect of it was there was like three pieces that wound up being the VA policy. Three um, aspects of it, three dimensions. One started out in California. It was actually a group of vets that were in Northern California. They had a new doctor that took over their pain management office there in their VA facility. And I had a whole string of vets that weren't even related to each other. They didn't know each other. They were coming to me and also coming to California Normal, Dale Geringer, and um, uh, you'll have to remind me. I'm skipping her name now. Our good friend out there in California Normal. Um,
Ellen Comp.
Ellen Comp, yeah, of course, Ellen Comp, and Ellen, um, really, I mean, I think she does more work with under California Normal to represent the constituency of cannabis in California than I've ever seen from like legislative offices. And she took it really seriously when these vets were complaining in California that they had been uh, kicked off of their pain management because they were testing positive for marijuana. And by then, I had been working with uh, sort of the ethics of cannabis for quite a while, working with a couple of different organizations. I don't want to get into the huge amount of details, but suffice it to say that I'd built up a certain toolkit over time of how to deal with, situations like this. And immediately I tried to identify, the problem. And the problem in this case was a doctor that it was new, as I said, replaced the old timer that didn't give them any problems in the pain management clinic. But there was a twist. This doctor actually should know better. This was a doctor that was actually part of the CMCR, the California Medical Cannabis Research Group, a doctor that has done cannabis studies himself, a doctor that knows the cannabis, you know, uh, science and evidence base. I was kind of blown away. I didn't really know how to even digest that. It turned out that he was sort of being overreactive to try to make sure that it gave every appearance of him being following the law, and not being biased in favor of marijuana. And he was doing what he thought he needed to do. And under normal circumstances, I would try to educate the doctor, work through the chain of command of that facility, educate the chief of staff, essentially, who would educate the doctor. This seemed different. I immediately went to the head of the CMCR, the California Medical Cannabis Research Group, a doctor down there in San Diego, and reached out to him to talk to this doctor. And at first he said, yeah, I'll talk to the doctor. And then he realized, this is a VA doctor now. I mean, even though he's his colleague under the CMCR, he was talking to him as a VA doctor. So immediately he's getting back to me through his aide. Well, let me go and talk to his, chief of staff. And then he's like, oh, maybe if instead of talking to the chief of staff, let's just address this to the VA. the regional VA. And then, and then, I mean, this is seriously like iterative conversations I'm having with his staff and trying to figure out who to have him talk to just correct this doctor that was doing this one little thing. Um, in the end, I wound up connecting him directly with the pain management directorate in Washington, D.C. And this is a funny little, sub part of the story because he clicked in with these folks. It turned out that the doctor in charge of the pain management directorate inside the VA went to school. This is a very conservative doctor in a very conservative place out there in San Diego, California. High, high, very esteemed doctor. They wound up locking in. I was in the conversation with them at first and introducing them and stuff. And when they realized who they were and locked into who they were and remembered each other, I quickly wasn't part of the conversation anymore. But what was born of that was the first draft, evidently, of a medical cannabis a policy inside the VA, all starting from dealing with patient advocacy cases out in California. And the second rung of that, the second, I said there was three pieces, right? The second piece was a vet in Montana. This vet in Montana got face to face with his director. And this wound up getting really interesting because the director of the facility herself laid down the law and said, no more cannabis on my watch. Anybody that gets caught up with cannabis, I'm going to kick you out of treatment. So she tried to do that with this vet and kick him out of treatment. And intervening in that case was actually quite simple. Going back to that toolkit I was talking about. And I'll tell you, the 30-second lesson on the toolkit, it's funny. You find it a Veterans Affairs, and I imagine this could work in other parts of the government as well, but in the Veterans Affairs system, in this case, an administrator, but a lot of times a doctor, and they're doing something they think is following the policy. You don't get in their face. You don't argue with them. You don't try to teach them the policy. You just ask them to tell you very clearly, show you the policy. You want to see it in writing. That's the first step A. Show me the policy. And then once they usually fail at step A because they think they're following a policy that they can't show you, or they wind up showing you something that's really not quite on spot. We had a veteran in Ohio that, following my advice, demanded that they show him the policy and the paperwork, and they gave him the Marijuana Tax Act from 1937. I'm not making this up. That was fairly recent in our history. I'm not talking about in 1940. I'm talking about like 10 years ago. He got that from an administrator, the Marijuana Tax Act, found unconstitutional, by the way, in 1969, and set into the record books. Very old, archaic, very out of date non-policy of the VA. So yeah, once you ask them for the policy, usually that's enough. If you have to, finally, in the end, show them the policy and teach them, through channels, through chain of command, you have their boss teach them, essentially. You work through the chain of command to have them, understand the policy. And it worked quite well with that administrator. So set that aside for a second and go to the third piece of the puzzle. This is Marty Chilcutt. Marty Chilcutt is a esteemed veteran friend who was out in Colorado when Prop 215 passed. And he looked at the situation, medical cannabis in Colorado and thought, we could do that here. We could do a medical marijuana thing here. He called up Ethan Nadelman and said, hey, we could do something in Colorado. What do you think? You guys back me if I try to do this? They backed him. The big funding that came available right after Prop 215 that was looking to do other initiatives came upon Marty Chilcutt ready to do all the groundwork. And because he did it, and I do attribute it to him, um, the Colorado medical marijuana initiative was a little different than most other medical marijuana laws around the country. It was set up uh, as a state constitutional amendment. And that's really important. That becomes very important in the history of medical cannabis in the United States if you study it, that fact. So, yeah. So, all right. So Marty comes from Colorado and moves to Michigan. And in Michigan, he says, hey, I can do that again. I can do an initiative in Michigan and starts doing the initiative. Marijuana Policy Project comes along and says, hey, Marty, we'd really like to run this initiative. We have a lot of resources and we can handle this. You did a great job in Colorado, but this is going to be a lot more moving parts. Let us take it over. We'll give you a grant to start an organization. And he started an organization called Veterans for Medical Marijuana Access. That organization was designed to basically do two things. One was to speak to cannabis issues in Michigan, and the other was to get doctors and healthcare providers on the record in resolutions supporting medical marijuana. Um, you really couldn't talk to people about medical marijuana inside the VA system. If you try to talk to administrators or any of the people connected to the VA, the different Veterans Affairs organizations, the veterans, uh, you know, uh, what do you call them? The American Legion, VA, VFW, all these types of service organizations, they wouldn't talk. Nobody would talk to you. At that time, if you talk to them about marijuana, they'd say, "Oh, that's federally legal. I can't talk to you about that." And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. So getting the resolutions done wasn't really working. Having these conversations and talking about it wasn't really working. But one thing that did work really well was every time the marijuana policy project or the initiative itself wound up doing something, passed some milestone, made some news, Marty wrote a letter or an op-ed and got it published in Michigan in one of the papers, or on public radio or whatever. He got published a lot during that initiative. And by the end of the initiative, when it actually passed and became law in Michigan, the first thing that happened was the TV news crews went to the VA spokesperson and said, "Hey, they talked a lot about veterans and medical marijuana during this initiative campaign. Now that it's passed, what say you?" And the spotlight's on them, right? And they said, "Well, according to our regional council, we're you're supposed to be treated with respect here at the VA. If you come in and use medical marijuana, you're to be treated fairly and not have any adverse effect on your care at the VA here. That's our policy." And wow, that I had been working with him already for a while, Veterans for Medical Marijuana Access, to skip to the end of the story, that's the organization I took over. That's what I use as my flagship to do a lot of things and get a lot of things done, including this VA policy. But here, I was blown away. I was like, "What are you talking about? What's this local regional council of Detroit?" And they said something of marijuana. I went down that rabbit hole and couldn't find anything really from Detroit. Did find some chatter back and forth between, the different doctors and the regional council. Really, nothing seemed to be resolved. I honestly don't know where that came from to this day. Where that public affairs person got that. They were put on the spot and they came up with it based on, I guess, what they should do. But it was beautiful. Anyway, I am working my way through this chain of command over there, and I find this, very interesting thing that Marty is talking about. And I formulated a question with a lot of help from the folks that I've been working with at the time. Fred Gardner even helped me with this question. And we wrote a question for the General Counsel of the VA based on what Marty had found in what he was doing in Michigan, and based on what I found working through the chain of command of the VA. We wrote a question to the General Counsel, asked him quite specifically about this hypothetical example of a veteran that was following all the rules and trying to really do it right and following doctor's orders and using medical marijuana. Should they really be punished? We inferred from the way the policy was written and everything we could find written that was your position. Should they really be punished? Was sort of the hypothetical question we gave to the General Counsel. And I have to tell you, I really expected the General Counsel to answer that question. He didn't. He actually forwarded it to Undersecretary of Health, who answered the question. And quite matter of factly, really, I was standing at my mailbox there and opened up this letter from the VA. I remember the VA's address was like 420, Washington, D.C. And it said, some fantastic things. The Undersecretary of Health wrote back to me and said, "I got your letter from the general, the General Counsel of the VA who forwarded me your letter, and I want you to, put your mind at ease. A veteran that's following all the rules and using medical marijuana, and following all the rules will not be punished inside the VA, and that should be treated like any other medication." Da, da, da. And he's saying it so matter of factly. I could tell you that wasn't written down anywhere in the world. And the minute I got that letter, I thought to myself, they're not going to believe me. If I just brought this in the house and put it in the scanner and put it on the web, two things were going to happen. People were going to say, I don't believe you that that's real. And the VA will disclaim it, which will make it worse. Because once the VA disclaims it, it's the end of the road for that whole line of argument. I thought to myself, well, we got to get somebody, a high ranking kind of media outlet would work, to fact check this and look at this and print it. And the first thought I had actually was the New York Times. But that's not who I went to first. I wound up going to the National Public Radio of Virginia, who dutifully sent over a reporter. The reporter got it. He really was excited. He brought it back to his publishers and the producers, and they were like, "Nah, it's a local story." No, they poo-pooed it. I can't believe it. I went to our friend Steve Fox in Colorado, who I've been working with for years on this post-traumatic stress stuff, all this veteran stuff, a brilliant cannabis activist, and worked with the Marijuana Policy Project, worked with Safer, worked with a lot of these entities at the time. And I asked him, what should we do? And he's like, you know what? As happens so many times in these kind of crazy things in the movement. Sure, Etienne, and Marilyn, you'll attest to this. But he knew somebody. He thought of somebody right off the bat. There was a reporter for the New York Times that had tried to write a front page article about the work that we were doing in Colorado, adding post-traumatic stress, based on the work that Brian Crum and others have been doing, adding post-traumatic stress in New Mexico, and how much of a trial and tribulation it was to add it in Colorado, and how much it helped vets around the country. He thought, this writer, thought that this was a really good story, that this was something that had legs. It should get the front page of the New York Times, but it didn't. The New York Times front page editorial board kicked it down and said it was a local story. Local being local to that region, I guess. And here I come along with this VA story. Steve sends me over to this reporter. Reporter asks me some questions. He's like, yeah, maybe this is national. I wind up talking to these editors. And I've been an activist for a long time. I've never had any conversations like that before or after in any setting, really, like the editors from the front page of the New York Times. They were on the spot like I've never seen anything before in my life. Just to give you an idea, at one point I think I sent them over links to like the Schaefer Commission, which is like five volume book, right? And they like consumed it and came back to me an hour later with more questions. They were just so fast. It was incredible. And one of the things they had deal breaker questions for me about this letter before they would publish it on the front page of the New York Times. One of the deal breaker questions was the VA is telling us this isn't new. This is the way it's always been. And there, I was able to use all our experiences fighting for years and getting all that feedback inside the system for years, working through the chain of command, how, oh, it's illegal, I can't talk about it, da da da, was able to shoot that down. And the VA actually, in the end, after negotiating for a while, kind of through this New York Times front page editorial board, the editorial board believed it was a story. They were ready to run the story of me in this letter. And the VA was like, hey, can you not make it about the letter and make it about a policy, and we'll publish a policy. Just give us a few days, we'll publish a policy. And I swear to you, man, it was one of the wildest things in my entire life. The New York Times editorial board coming and asking me, "Is that okay with you? You know, if basically if the story isn't about you and it winds up being a new policy, they put out a new policy instead." I was beside myself with joy at that idea. I really was. And that's what essentially happened. The VA policy that came out a few days later, I firmly believe they were going to come out with a policy in President Obama was that president, and then he ran reelected, and he got reelected. And I think that they were kind of looking ahead and thinking that they were going to come out with a policy in the next term. That way, it wouldn't, be political football. I really felt that at the time. And Al Byrne, working behind the scenes, he said that he was working with General Shinseki through family members, and having something like General Shinseki, inside the team there at the VA, working for us. If that helped tilt the scale, who knows? But anyway, the VA did I think, a really great thing when they came out with this policy. And the New York Times article, just in case you were wondering, really following along really closely and wondering whatever happened to that veteran in Montana. Well, the article wound up being about him. The cover article on the New York Times was about the VA and the veteran in Montana and how he had to fight to get his medicine back because the Veterans Affairs regional director was kind of off the beaten path, didn't really understand the policy. It was a good springboard to explain the new policy. And there was a new policy. And they named me and they talked about me in the article, but it wasn't about me. The article wasn't about me, and the policy isn't about me. And just so you know, all right, so we talked a lot about this. I haven't even said what the policy is. I should say that and then hand the mic back to you. The policy was like what, three parts or four parts. One part was just a matter of fact that the VA was saying, hey, we're federal property. The VA facilities, the hospitals, all that are federal property. If it's still illegal to have marijuana on federal property, we can't protect you from arrest. Basically warning vets to not be, stupid around on their campus with the cannabis, that, they put themselves in a position they may be arrested for possession of marijuana. That was first part. Second part was that they couldn't fill out the forms. They understood the medical marijuana programs and how there was a recommendation, not a prescription, and all that. And they looked and said, "Hey, the DEA is still threatening us. They're threatening us, with arrest if we facilitate any access to cannabis. So that's too close to the line for us. We can't fill out any forms or sign any recommendations or anything like that for you to get cannabis." Um, so what were we so excited about? We were excited about the last part of the policy, which said that essentially what Dr. Petzel, the Undersecretary of Health, said, that cannabis should be treated like any other medicine, that you should not ever be punished or have any punitive action taken against you in the VA system for using cannabis under doctor's orders under one of the state medical marijuana programs. And then they realized after passing that policy, they couldn't mention medical marijuana because of Schedule 1 making medical marijuana a forbidden subject completely. They revised the policy from 2010 when they passed it to 2011, and they removed those parts about the medical marijuana. That was a very fast version change from 2010 to 2011. That was essentially the biggest change, was removing the mentions of medical marijuana. There were specific examples of medical marijuana applications in the first policy. Those were all removed. But they got it. They got it. And they passed a policy that says now, if you're participating in a state program that allows you to access legal marijuana, and you're following the state laws and following advice of doctors or the program regulations, that you should not be punished at the VA. And um, yeah, that there shouldn't be any real departure in how you handle that from any other medication.
All
A long
right,
story,
go ahead.
right? A long story. Huh? I think I covered that. That was the backstory. I think I covered it. Never talked about it before, really. I don't think we've ever done it on a video or anything. So pardon the length, but it's a long story. Can't hear you.
All right, so again, we're talking about VHA Directive 1315. It's the official policy of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs that allows veterans to discuss their medical cannabis use with the VA healthcare providers without fear of losing your VA benefits. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. So, key points: it was originally issued in 2010, it was updated again in 2011, 2017, and most recently in 2023. And its purpose is to clarify that VA providers may discuss cannabis use with veterans, and that veterans will not be denied VA health care benefits solely for participating in state-approved medical cannabis program. So what it allows veterans can talk openly with their VA doctors about medical cannabis use. VA providers can document cannabis use in medical records, and VA will not disqualify veterans from care or services based on cannabis use alone. Okay. Um, and VA will not disqualify veterans from care or services based on cannabis use. Now, what it doesn't allow the VA cannot prescribe or recommend cannabis since it's still federally illegal. The VA does not cover the cost of cannabis, and veterans must follow state laws regarding medical cannabis where they live. And it matters because many veterans use cannabis for PTSD, chronic pain, insomnia, and other service related conditions. And Directive 1315 protects our rights to speak honestly with VA doctors without fear of losing medication, benefits, or care. It also encourages integrated and informed care between veterans and their providers. Okay. So, as we go now on to our next question, which is in our series here. One, please. So, how did the original release of the VHA Directive change the landscapes of veterans seeking to discuss medical cannabis with their VA health provider? Is the directive being applied consistently across the VA systems? And what did the new policy do to or for the medical cannabis activist movement?
So this is one of those things where I would love to take a whack at this and then hear what you guys have to say as well. But I was thinking about it. All three pieces I think I can answer really quickly. So the original 2010 release, how did it change the landscape for vets? um, Really, it didn't really change the landscape for vets. In fact, I still, to this day, recommend to veterans to take a very soft approach when they're talking to the VA healthcare provider. If the issue doesn't come up, don't bring it up. If the VA doctor seems very genuinely interested and wants to learn, educate them, teach them, overload them with information. If they don't, then tread very lightly because it can still wind up being a very tense discussion with a VA healthcare provider. The VA has never really educated their doctors, even to this day. They're doing some research right now, it sounds like, that will lead them to a better position to understand, how vets are using medical marijuana, integrate that in a little better, and be able to answer that a little better. But for now, if you're using medical cannabis, I've always gone with need to know. It's a doctrine I think we've all discussed in the military. Veterans all know about it. You really have to learn a lot, though. You have to know what the doctor knows about your condition. You have to understand your condition and read all the evidence-based research and stuff to know what you need to tell the doctor. For example, a heart condition, you need to tell the doctor if you're using cannabis. If you've got a family history of mental health disorders, for example, you need to discuss with your doctor. So there is some education on your part to really be able to practice that need to know. Is it being applied consistently across the VA systems? No. And strangely, the VA doctors at the bottom get all these memos all the time, of which this is one, a memo. 1315 is a memo. And those memos, according to the leadership that I talked to in the VA, are supposed to be taken like, with a grain of salt, so to speak, that the doctors are supposed to be acting based on their knowledge, their professionalism, their training, their medical license and everything, and acting appropriate to that. And where there's a question, to be answered, look to directives to understand things, but not in any way adversely affect that first thing, which is that doctor-patient relationship and their evidence-based, application of medical doctrine, standards of care, which are not flexible based on a memo. Memos don't change the medical standards of care. So, is it consistently being applied? No, it would be great if the VA would teach this and have a version of what we're talking about here, taught to doctors throughout the system so they understand what this policy is, what it means, and how to follow it. And what did it do for the medical marijuana movement? That was actually a surprise to me. I found it very surprising how much positive impact it had that I always say this and I'll say it now, veterans have always been part of the marijuana movement, like since the beginning. But I found that there was very little coalescing of veterans as veterans in the marijuana movement until after this policy. The policy sort of gave the veterans sort of the political cover, if you will, to have, marijuana organizations that were all veteran, run by veterans. And then since then, I think I lost count at like 40 veterans organizations, some service organizations, and most just cannabis activist organizations of different kinds, all completely veteran. So, what do you think, Marilyn?
Unmute myself. Yeah, it's it's that idea that the policy was happening, and it seemed, what we learned with veterans around the country, the VA docs didn't know about it, or didn't want to know about it, and didn't listen to the vet if they came in, once they were aware of the policy. So the confusion still seemed to be alive and well, among the VA. And I think, and then other people just didn't understand the fact that Dr. Petzel, when he made that directive and everything and was allowing them to use it, I mean, he clearly stated, the fact that it's illegal under federal law, so they can't bring it on the VA property. So, that's just an issue that it's different than, not, this isn't directly to the question, but it's just something I always wanted to make sure they understood. So you can be sick, you're allowed to use this cannabis if you got a recommendation from a physician, a civilian physician. VA can't hold it against you, but if you get sick enough to go in the VA hospital, you can't have your medicine then. So it still was a conundrum for patients for veterans who happened to be in a state where the law was allowed, where cannabis was allowed in that state. And as Al has said in the past, it's kind of like practicing medicine by geography. Depending, the state, the poor vet had to be in the right state, or it didn't matter. Other those issues just came to mind.
Well, you also, I think, Marilyn, have a very special perspective. I mean, the medical marijuana movement that I keep talking about really isn't much of a movement. There was, as far as advocacy organizations, there was like two or three, of which Patients at a Time was one. So, and I'm talking about in the whole world at the time. So, what do you think what did it, from your perspective, what did this new VA policy? I remember talking to the head doctor for the uh, human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, and he was working on access to medicine issues. Diedrich Lohmann over there in New York and in Vienna. And I just happened to, be meeting up with those guys just after this hit the paper in the New York Times. And he's like, "Oh, Michael, that was quite a pleasant surprise." He says, I mean, it was such it was like, I remember back in 1998 when at the United Nations we had this big UN meeting, and Ethan Nadelman that I talked about before in the Livingston Center, they paid a full page ad in the New York Times that came out during these UN meetings. And I remember it had such a big impact, that New York Times article had such a big impact on what happened inside the UN. And I would liken this to that. It was like this New York Times article and this new VA policy that all of a sudden, this was the United States federal government saying that medical marijuana was okay for vets, even though it's still illegal, even though it's Schedule 1, it has no medical value. We're going to allow it for our vets because of these state programs. It was almost like this, like legal loophole that I found that, created a little chink in their armor. I mean, at this time, and even to this day, we've really never broken through that armor against marijuana. We still have this rescheduling petition in the works, and we legalized hemp and stuff. But as far as marijuana being Schedule 1, it's still there in that, in that armored vault. And the only chink in that armor that I know of is this Veterans Affairs policy, really. Other than the Constitution itself, which is how the state programs work, of course.
Yeah, you're right. It was huge, and we're thinking the VA, that's a huge health system in the United States. I mean, that's the biggest health system. If they're saying that veterans can use it, that means something. Now, granted, again, they were stuck because of the federal law, but yeah, I think at the time we thought that was going to change things pretty rapidly. And I think when you look forward, then it's just been frustrating that no matter what, the roadblocks continue, and it's still in Schedule 1. I mean, last year we thought we were moving to Schedule 3, and that's, we're on hold with that now. So the veterans are stuck, and Patients at a Time, we've always, obviously, both Al and I being veterans, had a soft spot towards veterans, but it's like, my God, you go in and you're going to fight for the freedoms of this country and to come back wounded in one form or another and to not be able to use your medicine, it's like, that's just nuts. So the VA policy made sense, but the fact that nothing else has changed on the federal government is, it's just amazing. It's amazing that we're going on this fast. And I just want to note that people, for whatever reason, there's a J in my name there that has no, has, there's no J in my name, math 3. I'm just looking at that going. But anyway, that's an aside.
That's cute. It always reminds me of the Netherlands whenever I see a J inserted in a place like that.
I'm Norwegian.
Yeah, Norwegian. There you go. It's a Norwegian style. But yeah, I think that ATN, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this. We can hold this question. I got it in the chat so you can see it. Question 2. How did the original 2010 directive change the landscape for vets? Is it consistently applied in the VA system? And you know, the activist side of it, what did this new policy mean?
Well, for me, it didn't stop anything, but it was a significant change, at least in policy. Um, and that effectively allowed me later on to get access to my benefits, but I had kind of given up in frustration outright because of my inability to, after being removed from the VA facility, you know, four different times, I pretty much gave up until um, yeah, the PACT Act came later, and then I applied and eventually got my benefits. But, you know, I was happy to see this policy come forward. We were then curious how it was, you know, how it was going to be implemented by people. And of course, currently we have a FOIA request from the Veterans Action Council to get from the VA what disciplinary actions have happened, what has taken place since, well, at least in the most recent directive, going all the way back to 2010 would be a challenge because we've also seen a whole bunch of statistical changes with different states coming on board, specifically for cannabis, which, as we know, is something that we have worked very hard for over the decades, but we still have a major problem, which is treatment by geography. And that's fine if you're in one of these states. I'm in California, but yesterday I was in Texas. In Texas ain't got nothing. And what they had, they just took away. So if I would have been caught with my with my medicine in Texas, you know, I was looking at felonies, you know, all the above. So that's the current frustration that we're dealing with in the post 1315 world. But we're still dealing with more veterans every day come to us and ask us, well, I'm afraid to talk to my doctor about, you know, cannabis in the VA system because I'm afraid of losing my benefits. Well, it's 2025. This has been out since 2010. So the reality is that the VA has done a shit job educating people on what the law is. The states and the VSOs have done a shit job educating anybody on what the laws are because we're still getting those questions every day. And so that's one reason why we decided to have this VAC roundtable, because we're the Veterans Action Council. Action's our middle name. And that's why we have FOIA requests going, because we want to find out more data, because we were able to find a data shift change because of the or the most latest update to this Directive 1315, which we'll be going into shortly. But yes, the release of the 2010 helped, but it's not helping. I don't think it's being applied consistently across VA systems. Unfortunately, because as we know, depending on what VA we go to, we can get different care altogether. And that is, again, that's just your standard treatment by geography problem, right? I want to be able to get my Dr. Big Mac, the same Dr. Big Mac I get. You know what I'm saying? But unfortunately, we have ideologies that unfortunately tug and pull, and doctors use their own personal ideologies all the time in the VA. We've all seen it happen. We've all seen doctors or nurses that are friendly, and we've all seen doctors and nurses that are not, or that are hostile to the issue. So, again, the VA has to do a better job of solidifying its directive across the board because it took the Veterans Action Council filing for a FOIA request to actually find the most recent one. So that in itself is a frustration. So I think that we have a ways to go. I think that this is a start. But there's a lot of controversy and a lot of veterans who are ignorant to the issues, willfully ignorant to the issues, because you can search the internet and find this information out, but it's a little bit of a search. So, again, the VA could put it in a little easier spot for people to access and have information access. So, that's why we're educating you about this VHA Directive 1315 so that you can be educated, so you can go to your other veterans and tell them about it, and they'll tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on and so on. That was a commercial back in the day, but that's because it's still done. Activism is still done person to person. We still get questions daily from veterans who are afraid to use their cannabis because they're afraid they're going to use their benefits or especially their pain medications. Okay, so that becomes the mix, and the fear when people are regulating their pain through prescribed medications through the VA. This is where a lot of MYTH information kind of came out, and that myth information hasn't helped anybody. So that's, again, why 1315 was written, and that's why we're educating you on 1315. Okay. We'll go to our next question. Will be Marilyn Mathry with question number 3.
And that is, to what extent are VA providers aware of Directive 1315? And are they adequately trained or informed about their role in discussing medical cannabis with veterans? And I think we all kind of just touched on that question. And that is a big question. It's a directive. Do they really all know about it? Because as many veterans have found out, their VA provider often is clueless about it. So I don't think the VA did a great job about it. From Patients Out of Time's perspective, I literally I met, gosh, this was years ago, but I met through, my background in nursing is substance abuse, addictions nursing. So at one of our conferences, we had like the assistant to the chief nurse of the VA system was speaking. And it was interesting. She was there speaking about substance abuse in general. And she happened to say, she really cared about this issue. She was a veteran, but her spouse or boyfriend at the time was a amputee, I believe, or something. And I started thinking, gee, I wonder if he uses cannabis, et cetera. So I contacted her after and was trying to get an appointment with that chief nurse, and wrote a letter and was talking about the directive and how important this was for veterans, and would it be possible to somehow educate the nurses on this? But I just got back one of those answers of, we'll have our doctors look into this, we'll look into more about cannabis and if it's helpful or not. And I wrote back again and told them about our conference series, because I said, I don't think your physicians know anything about the endocannabinoid system or the use of cannabis. We'll provide the information if you want it. But it just I got lost in the shuffle. So it's the intimidation of that Schedule 1 goes to so many people, and it depends on, like I said, like you say, at different VA hospitals. Some VA hospitals might be somebody who's running it who gets this and is open and wants to make sure the clinicians know about it. And then there are some who still maintain that it's a bad drug and we can't use it, we're not going to talk about it. So yeah, I don't think they're adequately educated. I don't think most VA docs know anything about the endocannabinoid system. I don't think they're educated, and I don't think they know the policy. Michael?
Yeah, so when you talk about discussing medical cannabis with their patients, there's another string of the history that I didn't talk about that's actually quite important. Um, it's sort of uh, I guess I don't know. You tell me if it's a cohesive string, but it's a string in my mind nonetheless. One part of it is the early on, and I'm talking about before I even got started, back when Dr. Mikaria, who I talked about before, was being attacked by the federal government or saying that they were going to arrest him and stuff like that. At that time, that was right after Prop 215. You're talking about like 1997. And he was really being under attack from the federal government. The drug czar, remember, he had a picture of Dr. Mikaria and he said it was Cheech and Chong medicine. He said that on a press conference, remember? And at that time, that was when the VA asked the DEA for guidance. And I know this because of working in the chain of command. I got this feedback. I know this history from the inside. I don't have the documentation. We tried to find the actual documents where the DEA answered the VA, and we actually haven't been able to find it as of yet. But they described it to me, the folks that I was working with that I talked about before inside the chain of command. And essentially what it was is they asked the DEA, hey, all these veterans are using this medical marijuana. What's our position? And the DEA told them the same thing that they were saying out in public, in regards to the Cheech and Chong medicine and all that. If you remember, the drug czar was saying, we're going to arrest these doctors. If you write a recommendation, we're going to arrest you. You're going to shut you down, take away your medical license. That's what they were threatening at the time. And of course, the VA was very concerned about this, threat. This is a very serious threat. In a way, they got that memo, if you will, from the DEA. But what happened next, they didn't get the next memo, which was when that was tested. Remember, the McCaffrey was brought to court by a bunch of doctors. Dr. Conan, the ACLU represented him and went to court in federal court out on the West Coast and sought an injunction against the federal government, taking away their license or harassing them for just recommending cannabis, because they should be able to do that as part of their free speech, they argued. And they won in the appeals court. Conant versus McCaffrey. It was later relisted Conant versus Walters, the next drug czar named Walters. But they won Conant, and then I believe the government asked the Supreme Court to take on the case. They refused, but at any rate, the Supreme Court never took on the case. So that was the end of it. That's the law on the West Coast, the Ninth Circuit, the federal court, that there's an injunction. I don't think it was ever lifted. It's an injunction preventing the federal government from harassing doctors for writing recommendations. But that never really, I don't know of any time where any doctors inside the VA got that information. They were never told that that was happening on the outside, if you will, like as if there's an inside and an outside of this big wall. And the VA doesn't really have a wall. And the doctors are all, regular people drawn from the community that have medical licenses somewhere. But yet they really have never learned and never really knew about the result of that Conant case. And working again with Marty Chilcutt, we looked at that and thought, what can we do with this? And it seemed to us that free speech element, it's funny, ironic, I guess, because remember before I said that the free speech and all that it didn't help me at all inside the VA. What wound up helping inside the VA, if you remember, I said was ethics. It was unethical to take away someone's treatment. But here's a case where all of a sudden your actual constitutional rights come into play because yeah, I'm totally spacing out, but yeah, Marty.
Well, let me just say, Michael, while you're gathering your thoughts, as you reminded me, yeah, folks, that was back in the day that it was General McCaffrey, retired general, who was the drug czar. And, it's like him talking about medical cannabis. It's like, what would he know? He had no background in knowing that. And I bring that up because for Patients Out of Time at the time, we were had been collecting resolutions by different organizations. And we had a list, it was in the hundreds now, going on organizations that supported access to medical cannabis. And we're using that to say, you couldn't. And one of the organizations was the International Nurses Society on Addictions, of which I was on the board when I wrote one. The board passed it, and then the drug czar's office started calling. They called our home. They called the International Nurses Society on Addictions headquarters about the resolution, and they referred them to me. They got to my address, and it was literally trying to threaten us, like, take it down. And I was off the board at the time, and they literally then talked to the president of the organization, who unfortunately was acquiesced at a board meeting of the organization without. There was a board meeting, and this was not on the agenda, but she brought up the fact that the drug czar's office called up and did not like the resolution we had that was, advocating for patient access to cannabis, and the board voted to take it down. Not overwhelmingly, but one of the board members called me up to say, Mary Lynn, you wouldn't believe what just happened. And I called the president of the organization saying, what are you going to tell the members now? What are you going to tell them, that they know this is a resolution we have and you've just rescinded it? What reasoning are you going to give them that you rescinded it? Did something happen? And they quietly never mentioned anything. They just, because it was embarrassment. I said, you're having a retired general telling you, that there has no merit, and you're bowing to him. They actually called the American Society of let's see, it's the Addictions Medical Society. I can't remember exactly how it goes. The American Society of Addictions Medicine, ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, and got them to rescind theirs, but they did not rescind one that asked for more research on cannabis or something. I mean, yeah, again, folks, the days of the DEA and the drug czar's office, they were so anti-cannabis and trying to shut down information. Just really sad.
It's one thing to be anti-cannabis and another thing to overtly try to eliminate any information that's based on evidence that contrary to your position. I actually, on that same line, that same rabbit hole, I actually witnessed an American Medical Association meeting where they were presented with this scientific resolution. That's why I was there. I was with Marijuana Policy Project working on this resolution that has some great language about medical marijuana. And that same group that you're talking about, ASAM, one of the head people inside the AMA board got up, is from ASAM, and he had an impassioned plea for everybody to not sign the resolution because it might hurt their relationship with the federal government, because the federal government Schedule 1. So you wonder, why so much of this information about medical marijuana really never reached a lot of the people that it needed to reach back then. That was some of the behind the scenes stuff. So anyway, I remember what I was getting at now. The point I was getting at was that we looked at this whole situation, with what the VA knew, and you got to put yourself in that mindset of that moment, with Conant versus McCaffrey was fairly new. And we thought, hey, we can actually educate people about the outcome of that Conant case, and at the same time use that, the veterans example to do it. It's a win-win. We'll educate everybody inside the system, the veterans, everybody. It'll educate them about the VA policy, which was something we were trying to educate them about, the limitations of the policy, which was specific to what we wanted to talk about. And what we wound up saying was very straightforward. This new VA policy, it's great that the VA recognizes that cannabis is used by veterans and, won't, be punitive against any of the veterans using the medical marijuana. But at the same time, the Conant case, they said that it was part of the free speech of the doctor and the patient to talk about medical marijuana. Even more, the Conant case, they said that it was important to the doctor-patient relationship that they had that free speech. And we recognized, basically conceded that the doctor at the VA does not have free speech. They don't. As a government employee, you give up certain free speech. But we contended that for them to be a doctor and do doctor stuff inside the VA, they should be afforded that free speech that the Conant case argued was necessary for that doctor-patient relationship. We made this argument heavy, with op-eds and, all kinds of letters to the editor. We wrote some papers on it and stuff, and it wound up getting picked up by the movement. I'm very proud to say that line of argument, that narrative, and it became a bill, the Veterans Equal Access Act, Congressman Blumenauer picked it up, and Sam Farr, I think, was one of the first to pick it up. And it's at this point, it's been run a dozen times or more. They're still trying to pass it, and what it does is it forces the VA to protect the doctors who, because of their doctor-patient relationship with a patient, are put in a place where their medical standards of medical practice and medical evidence would have them convey some positive thing about marijuana to their patient in the form of, let's say, a written piece of paper that could be used as a recommendation under state medical marijuana law, that doctor would be protected. And the VA is still, all this time, has been balking that because of the DEA, threat that has never really been retracted. The VA is really caught in an uncomfortable place. But they did recognize, let me show you something. They did, I'll share screen here if I can do this. And this is the 2017 version of VHA Directive 1315, access to VHA clinical programs for veterans participating in state-approved medical marijuana. You notice they dropped the medical marijuana programs. And then summary of major changes. Major changes include adding policy to support the veteran-provider relationship when discussing the use of marijuana and its impact on health, including veteran-specific treatment plans. That language reflects the Congress back and forth with the VA and them getting put on the spot, because in Congress, the VA told the congressional representatives that veterans should feel very free to discuss marijuana, of course, saying that they had free speech essentially. But how do you have free speech when Conan argued that the recommendation itself was free speech? See the conundrum that we got them caught in. And to this day, they're still caught in that conundrum. But that, when you see that role of discussing medical cannabis with the veterans, that's what I think of to this day, is that conundrum that the VA has found itself in, where to be good doctors, they need to have free speech necessary to support the doctor-patient relationship, and to follow the standards of medical care, they need to be evidence-based and open-minded about the use of medical cannabis. That's that their ethics, if nothing else, require that, right? Mary, you got the only medical license in the crew. What I just said sounds right, huh?
Sounds right.
Sounds left too. That's all we're left with. um, Now, of course, beforehand, I was speaking historically, and I think that doctors are better at it. I've only recently gotten my VA benefits, and so I recently have been to VA hospitals and discussing it. My physician, of course, I'm in San Francisco, so I have a very educated doctor set because they come from UCSF as well. So they're highly educated, thanks to other pioneers along the way that have made that possible. So I had no issues discussing my cannabis with. They understood who I was, my history, and I actually got an apology. Therapist actually apologized because of the system that we changed, and my friends and I helped change because I couldn't get my access. So we changed the system so I could have the access, and I do. But it doesn't mean that we have well-educated doctors across the board. Again, I'm very fortunate. But, if I went to the Central Valley, I'm not sure I'm going to get the same love. If I went to Arizona, unsure. If I went to someplace like Kentucky, oh, lots of questions. So again, you're good if you're in states where you're educated on cannabis, but in those states where it isn't, are the doctors and nurses educated on it so that you can talk about it? You let us know. Because none of us here are in states where that's a possibility. We've changed the systems where we are, and we're dealing with that reality set. But not everybody is fortunate, and there's millions of Americans without this access. So that's a frustration that we see and that we want applied across the board. Um, so that's where that stands. So let's move on to our next question. So, what are the most significant changes introduced in the 2023 modification of Directive 1315? And what implications do they carry for veterans that are currently using cannabis? And has it helped or hindered real world access and dialogue? Councilmember Crowitz.
Writing myself a note. So yeah, this is another place where I can call our attention to the effect of our activism and how we've had this kind of dialogue, if you will, between our cannabis culture, called our cannabis movement, cannabis industry. There's a lot of different titles you could give it. But let me see if I could pull this up here. Um, this is the directive from this is the most current one now. It's July 28th, 2023, VHA Directive 1315. And when you go to summary of major changes, it updates the roles of some patient care people and stuff like that, removes responsibility from another. But here, quite interesting, clarifies definition of marijuana to account for updates in the U.S. Code as a result of the Agriculture Improvement Act, what we call the hemp legalization bill. So here we legalized hemp and it caused the VA to have to change its policy. I think that's fascinating. But this VA policy has only become really more uh, sort of structured and more professionally, sort of connected to the VA system, embedded in you know accompanying regulations and stuff that they point to. There's rather large patient care um, standards documents and stuff that they have in the VA. And if you read those, it's very clear that the doctor is supposed to do what I was saying before, use their training and their expertise and their medical license and all their medical standards of care and apply that in a real world way to each patient in a way where the patient and the doctor work together in a treatment plan that works well for the patient's needs on a one by one individualized care basis. And that's how they're supposed to be doing it. Um, in the VA. Um, the VA policy supports that. It really does. Um, and if I think if they were adequately trained and if they were able to better uh, understand what we're doing. Let me talk about something. Let me see. I don't I don't know if this fits in anywhere else, so let me just throw it in here. This is something that really bugs the heck out of me. I'm going to share something else here. Um, this is the VA. First of all, let me documents. So if you want to learn about the history of the cannabis policy in VA, go to that legal and clinical evolution of the Veterans Health Administration policy on medical marijuana. It's an author is Cynthia Geppert, Dr. Geppert. She's one of the doctors that I worked with inside the ethics committee. And look at her. I love her credentials: MD, MA, PhD, MPH, MSBE. She's pretty badass. And I'll tell you, she wrote this great article. I really think it's quite authoritative about the history of the medical marijuana policy inside the VA. She did it without interviewing me. She did it by talking to others and filling in the pieces like a good journalist would. I'm impressed by that because if you read this, it's quite a very adequate, captures some of that backstory that I talked about with the New York Times and all that. So that's one thing I'll show you. Of course, the two directives I already showed you, but the easy way to find those is this VA public health document. It's publichealth.va.gov/marijuana.asp. VA marijuana veterans need to know. And it talks about, right off the bat, veterans will not be denied VA benefits because of marijuana use, just like the stuff we've been talking about. I mean, this is it. This is the policy of the VA. You should not be afraid to use medical cannabis and improve your, life and your relationships with others in so many ways as a cannabis program can of access. Yeah, you shouldn't be afraid to do that. And especially as we know, so well, and Dr. Mikaria found so well that many veterans reduce their amount of pills that they need, quite significantly, and most will reduce it somewhat. So anyway, if you go down to the bottom of that page, as I'm showing here, it gives you that full directive, which is a PDF. So it just doesn't really live on its own page. And that's the Directive 1315. Can be found in this public health, VA, marijuana, what veterans need to know. And then what I was going to complain about is this. The VA PTSD, National Center for PTSD website, and it's ptsd.va.gov, all this stuff here, /professional/treat/co concurring /marijuana_PTSD_vets.ask. And if you read this, this was actually written by someone we know that worked with Dr. Sisley, Dr. Sue Sisley, on a failed effort to look at cannabis for post-traumatic stress, where many to most who were involved in that project complained vigorously about the product, the cannabis product that they were getting from the University of Mississippi, the government weed, that was inferior and could very well have undermined the effectiveness of the cannabis in that study. There also could have been other problems, like the study protocol itself, not having anything to do with, whether it was efficacious. And if you read this page, I'm not going to read any of it, but if you read the whole page, you come away feeling like, oh, wow, we don't really know anything about cannabis and post-traumatic stress. What we do know isn't very good. It's scary. Any efforts have failed. There's no real reason to think we'd even want to use cannabis for post-traumatic stress. And I get very offended by that. Personally, as an activist, I get extremely offended by that. And I want, you guys can, give me a little minute here. And this is a great forum because we've never really bothered anybody that wants to take a little time to explain something. Let me explain why that offends me, that they're taking that position. Because I took over Veterans for Medical Marijuana Access, called it Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. That was a subtle change we made. We never even changed the name because we felt like marijuana and cannabis are synonymous. Just use them in various ways in various places, and we didn't even change the name. Al Byrne helped me as a partner in this project to decide what to do with that organization when Marty stepped down. And we decided, instead of doing what we had done before on many organizations, setting up a board and creating a not-for-profit status with the IRS and collecting fundraising and all this stuff, we decided to forego all that. And as veterans, we thought we could work within the sort of infrastructure of the cannabis movement, if you will, to do some things and affect some things without all that bother. We just do it as a voluntary effort. And I ran this effort, and one of the things that we picked up as a project was working on cannabis for post-traumatic stress. Two vets that I work with, Johnny Evans from Michigan, wrote a portfolio. It was like a 150-page portfolio, dropped it on my desk, cannabis for post-traumatic stress. The whole thing just loaded with a very strong scientific evidence that could be considered evidence in support of the use of cannabis for post-traumatic stress. Al spent a whole career working on, real world issues with vets and seeing how cannabis can be effectively applied, and with patients at a time. And you, Mary Lynn, have gotten people like Dr. Michelin to come and speak and talk about related things like the memory eraser function of the cannabis receptor system, and how cannabis works to modulate systems throughout the body and deal with nerve pain and things. You add all that together, and you can easily see why cannabis would be effective for post-traumatic stress. But also, there's a study in Canada on this drug called Sesamet. It's a analog of THC, and the thing they decided to study on it for FDA approval was if it was effective for cessation of nightmares from treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress. And they got approved for it. They did a study and found, in a gold standard double-blind placebo-based study, that a THC substitute helped with post-traumatic stress. So, that to me is quite meaningful. I mean, it's not cannabis. I'm going to concede that it was a Sesamet. It was this copy of THC, but you can't tell me that, this fake apple does this or that. And I'm wrong to assume the real apple might do it too. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So anyway, that's the world that I came into this with, with this really strong, I think, very strong body of evidence to support the use of cannabis for
Mike, can
post-traumatic.
you take the screen down, please?
Yeah, man. So anyway, that's to finish this, Etienne. Um, Brian Crum really got the ball rolling. California, of course, got the ball rolling because Prop 215 allowed for cannabis to be used for post-traumatic stress. There's no list in California. The first list that had post-traumatic stress was New Mexico, and that was because of our nurse practitioner friend and military veteran Brian Crum and his influence on the process, and also pulling in the same medical knowledge that I'm talking about. His standard there in New Mexico is what we use to create a nationwide effort to add post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition. And we succeeded at that because we had doctors with their patients and scientists willing to come in and speak about the science on a case-by-case basis in all these legislatures across the country and answer their question in an honest way and show them the evidence. And they passed these laws to allow patients, veterans included, to use cannabis for post-traumatic stress throughout the United States. And the results, you tell me, Etienne, you're more close to the, tire meets the road on this than I am, actually seeing patients on a day-by-day basis. But I've never seen any long line of bodies of patients or caregivers that said, oh, no, no more. Cannabis was not worth the benefits didn't outweigh the risks, or that cannabis was a bad idea for our post-traumatic stress patients. That's what this post-traumatic stress page says.
Oh, the American Psychological Society will be against it because they're always against anything positive cannabis wise. But for the most part, no, we don't see any issues. And to clarify, people, again, the 2023 update to the VHA Directive 13 introduced several notable changes. Okay, key changes including clarification of marijuana's definition. The directive updated the definition of marijuana to align with changes in federal law, specifically reflecting updates to the 21 USC 80216 as a result of the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, the Farm Bill. This changes acknowledges the evolving legal landscape concerning cannabis-derived products. Two, the reassessment of responsibilities, revised roles and responsibilities within the VA, including updates for the Assistant Undersecretary for Health for Patient Care Services and Operations, and added responsibilities for the Executive Director, Health Solutions, and VA healthcare providers. It also removed responsibilities previously held by the chief consultant and the population health services. Three, support for veterans a provider relationship. It emphasized policies that support the relationship between veterans and their healthcare providers when discussing marijuana use and its impact on health, including the development of veteran-specific treatment programs. So these updates basically aim to enhance the clarity and consistency of the policies regarding medical cannabis amongst veterans by aligning definitions with federal law and delineating responsibilities within the VA. The directive seeks to facilitate more informed and supportive discussions between veterans and their healthcare providers. It is important to note that while the directive allows for open discussion of cannabis use, VA providers are still prohibited from recommending, making referrals to, completing forms, or registering veterans for participation in state-approved marijuana programs as long as cannabis remains classified as a Schedule 1 substance under federal law. In practice, the effectiveness of these updates depends on the consistent implementations across VA facilities. So keep that in mind. All right. So, Michael, you're up with our next question.
So I think we're on number 5 there. We've
Yep.
seen updates, as you said, 18, in 2011, 2017, and most recently in 2023. Before I go on in this question, point out that it was passed in 2010, updated just 1 year later, and then it was 6 years later and then 5 years. And it actually says that it should be 5 years. But it's all over the board. That's why we really didn't expect it in 2023. And that's why it's 2025 right now as we're doing this, and we're just now doing this, is because of that strange time dilation there. We weren't really we were doing other things in 2024, 2023. Before I go on to the rest of the question, though, that does remind me to say that everybody, if they want to check out what the VA has done on this, just before this policy came out in 2023, the VA sit rep did a little video on YouTube about this cannabis policy. And basically all they did was talk about the fact, as we read, that you shouldn't have any punitive action taken against you at the VA for using medical marijuana, the basics that we've been talking about. But that is the VA itself doing that, which was quite powerful, and we appreciated that. So did these updates, did any of them significantly improve, or did they complicate how veterans engage with their providers? Do veterans feel confident discussing their cannabis use with their VA providers without fear of losing benefits or being stigmatized despite the protections in the directive? What challenges remain in making sure doctors understand they can talk about cannabis without penalizing veterans? For me, again, these policies are so abstract. They've done more, I think, in the activist world than they've done in the real world, on the day-to-day basis. It's not like veterans are really using this as a weapon to defend themselves inside the facility. Generally over time, though, as Etienne pointed out, they do seem to be getting the memo over time. It does seem, I think it's our work out in the world that's done more good than anything. As Etienne pointed out, I think the VA has done a horrible job of educating their providers on this stuff. Do people still fear losing their benefits or being stigmatized? One of the interesting things that we found working out in the field, and I suppose you could, back this up, Etienne, with your experience, is that veterans have been a lot of the patients in medical cannabis programs. In other words, medical cannabis programs, no matter what state they were in, have had a very good portion of their patients or vets, number one. And number two, that those vets in almost all those states that have legalization, in other words, adult recreational access, where you just show ID and buy it versus just a medical cannabis program. In all those states, pretty much they have a medical program and the adult rec program. And a lot of our vets go for the adult rec program because they don't want to be going through being put on a list, having, doctors' recommendations and stuff like that. The cost is an issue for people living on a fixed income like veterans, but also just being on a list was always brought up to me by a lot of vets. They didn't want to have their name put on a list and be in some way trackable by the federal government for their marijuana use. So I think that's still a thing that we haven't gotten away from yet, and making sure the doctors don't penalize veterans. I think it I I think it's really tied to the other drugs. This is one of the problems I had early on with my work was I went to Ethan Nadelman. I talked about him before, and I talked to him about what I was working on. And he said, "Oh yeah, well, pain management and stuff like that, it's legal drugs. To go talk to people that work on legal drugs. I work on illegal drugs," he tells me. But it's the intersection of the legal drugs and the illegal drugs, so to speak, that we're having the issue with. But it's the illegal, not the illegal drugs, not cannabis. The cannabis isn't really creating a problem. The doctors that we've talked to, all of them are completely in unison, talking about the lower level risk from cannabis as compared to opiates and things like that. That's a consensus, even amongst doctors that hate cannabis, they would concede that. It's there's no comparison really about cannabis and opiates and things like that. So, it's the opiates and things like that, even treatments for psychiatric issues, post-traumatic stress, some of these so-called psych meds. You can run into issues where the doctor just feels like they need to police their patients. They need to drug test them. And in the system, because cannabis is Schedule 1, still to this day, in many places, you'll just immediately be labeled as cannabis substance use disorder. And they can do that because the cannabis substance use disorder DSM, criteria that they go by in the psychiatric world is, rather easy to comply with. basically by cannabis just being technically illegal and what you have to do to get it. It's very unfair, the situation with that regard. And I think it's up to doctors, really, to a certain extent. They have to really live up to their ethics and their standards and learn and be educated. We're, patients at a time. Mary Lynn can talk about the struggles to give doctors this information, continuing medical education credits, what that works like and stuff. But that fits in there, I think. So, but that's my answer.
I just wanted to add in terms of the post-traumatic stress, for example, that there is evidence out there. And unfortunately, Sue Sisley's study, she had to use the Mississippi-grown cannabis, which is not real-world cannabis. It's low THC, and so it wasn't a fair use. She's going to be, looking more at real-world cannabis. But we do want evidence-based studies. But there's also something called practice-based evidence, and cannabis fits into that perfectly. This is not a new drug. It's an old plant that's been used medicinally for thousands of years. And now what we have, when you talk about post-traumatic stress, when you have veteran after veteran after veteran coming in and saying, this saved my life. I was ready to commit suicide. Cannabis saved my life. And they say that story over and over and over again. You got to look at it and say, there's something to it. And there's practice-based medicine. They're not getting into trouble with it. It is literally saving their life. And actually the science from Ethan Russo, looking at the science of the endocannabinoid system, looks at, a veteran with post-traumatic stress has been stressed so heavily that it's done harm to their own endocannabinoid system, because the endocannabinoid system is there to protect us from stressors. Well, when you're overly stressed, it's deficient then. And so it makes sense that cannabis would help replenish this system that is designed to keep us in balance. But it's just it's just nuts for any veteran ever to be penalized for using something that's not hurting anyone else. I mean, and all they can tell you is, I'm feeling better, I'm sleeping, I'm not having the nightmares, I can, whatever it is, the pain is better. It's unconscionable that this continues. Patients out of time. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And we started with the idea, if we'd educate people about the therapeutic use of cannabis in accredited conferences to get healthcare professionals to come. Unfortunately, due to the Schedule I status, many healthcare professionals are still a little scared to come to a conference about cannabis. But the idea of educating them to get them to know the amount of science that's there 30 years later, and we're still stuck. It's frustrating.
Yeah, and how do we get unstuck? Well, this policy's only been around 14 years since the first one in 2011. So what's the differences? Well, the improvements. 2011 and 2017 basically clarified that veterans will not be denied VA services for using cannabis in accordance with state laws. The 2023 really brought updated legal definitions due to the post 2018 Farm Bill and emphasized supporting veterans provider relationships, urging providers to consider cannabis use in the context of individualized treatment plans. So, we have many lingering challenges still. Inconsistent implementation is still the biggest problem. Despite national policy, the experience varies greatly across VA facilities, as we said prior. Some veterans report supportive conversations, while others are met with silence, suspicion, or outdated attitudes. Another challenge, provider awareness. Many VA clinicians either aren't fully aware of Directive 13 or are unaware how to navigate the cannabis conversation within the bounds of federal law. This creates a hesitancy, even when the directive protects the discussion. And then, of course, the stigma and fear. We continue to express, we veterans, the fear of disclosing cannabis use because we're concerned about losing access to pain meds or PTSD treatment. Being labeled a drug user, not a fan. I happened to me just because I just discussed my cannabis use with the VA. And of course, facing subtle or overt stigma in their medical records or caring planning. You know what I'm saying? People, especially with high pain meds and pain med use, are the ones who come to us frequently and ask how do they navigate these waters, right? So it's very much a challenge. So we need stronger internal training at the VA so that providers know exactly what they can and cannot say and what veterans are protected. And again, the reason for this video is to empower you. You can print a copy of your Directive 1315 and take it down to the VA and show them and be the educator, right? Two, consistent system-wide communications to veterans that cannabis conversations are safe, legal, and encouraged under the directive. We do know that, there is the sit rep. Can veterans use marijuana? VA benefits in using marijuana, CBD, THC, cannabis. And, that's a pretty old sit rep. It's a few years old. So, but it's out there and that video is available and you can even search for it directly on the YouTubes. And then the monitoring and feedback mechanisms to ensure facilities are applying Directive 13 fairly and uniformly. So we still have a ways to go. All right, the final question will go to Councilmember Mathery.
Okay. Actually, before I do that, I wanted to say one more thing about pain meds and way back when we started with this with contracts. There is a reason for not a good reason, but one of the reasons that the docs felt necessary to do pain contracts with patients, even though, as Michael said, they're not really contracts, was if they're providing an opiate, they want to make sure the patient isn't taking benzodiazepines that they don't know about, other opiates that they don't know about, marijuana for whatever reason, et cetera, because of the potential danger. If they're taking benzos along with something, it could be a deadly combination. So there was a safety reason. But along comes the opiate epidemic. We got a huge problem, deaths going all over it. The Centers for Disease Control actually put out some guidelines for physicians. And in those guidelines, I think it's number 10 and 11, they're specifically saying, well, I shouldn't say specifically, they're so indirectly, but clearly saying it's something like, in doing drug tests for your patients, it would be wise to, sometimes you might want to omit some substances, for example, marijuana. And they said that because they recognized that when somebody tested positive for marijuana, the doc would then kick him out of the program. So then the patient went to the street and would use opiates. And so even the CDC was saying, you don't have to test for cannabis, if you're worried about safety. This is not a safety issue. It's, if anything, most patients use less opiates. So it's silly. It's the stupidest thing that they find out someone's using cannabis and okay, I'm not going to give you opiates anymore. There's no rational reason for it. Anyway, I wanted to throw that out there. So question number 6, where do we go from here? Explain VAC's vision for veterans' medicinal access to cannabis through a voucher similar to those used for veterans' clothing allowance. And you guys can probably talk to that specific thing easier, but it's a great idea.
Well, the idea was born out of necessity and the problem, of course, due to the treatment by geography, right? Um, as we've watched the landscape continue to evolve nationwide, we believe it's time for the VA to move beyond simply allowing conversations about cannabis and towards recognizing it as a legitimate therapeutic option for veterans. Our vision is simple, practical, and rooted in existing VA frameworks. The VAC's proposal for a cannabis voucher system is just like what the VA currently does with the VA clothing allowance. And so we're proposing an actual cannabis voucher system. It provides an annual stipend, or it could be monthly, to veterans who medically necessarily devices uh, so that we can envision a medical cannabis voucher around the stipend that currently allows medical 100% veterans to get necessary devices for their clothing, etc. They can select their own. The VA doesn't do that. They give them a voucher. So the voucher respects federal limitations without forcing the VA to distribute cannabis directly. It leverages existing state licensed state programs and empowers veterans to choose plant-based medicines. It also helps reduce dependency on opioids and other pharmaceuticals, which, as we know, is something that they want to give us en masse. Now, how it could work? Well, the veterans already authorized VA disability care could receive an annual or quarterly stipend or monthly or voucher to use at state approved medical cannabis dispensaries. Like the clothing allowance, the system would be needs based, tied to medical conditions potentially, evidence supported with cases of documentation from the VA or non VA providers. And it's easy to administer, building on existing VA benefits disbursement program. The goal is basically safe, equitable, and affordable access to cannabis as medicine. A formal VA acknowledgement from the VA that cannabis plays a real role in veterans' wellness programs and their wellness plans outright. Reduction in harm from over medication with pharmaceuticals, especially opioids and benzodiazepines. And an empowerment. Veterans can take control of their healthcare choices with dignity and transparency. So we aren't asking for special treatment. We're just asking for fair, modern, and medically sound options. Veterans already earn the right to access the care that they need. It's time the VA to acknowledge that cannabis is not just a conversation, but it's a practical policy that meets veterans where they are. It does not solve the problem of treatment by geography, but we need to get started somewhere. And the idea was basically born out of the cannabis the Veterans Cannabis Access out of Canada, which was brought forth starting back in 2004. It was originally 10 grams, but now it's down to 3 grams per day, where the veteran gets if you're 100% disability, you get 3 grams per day free of charge. And you get to select your modality. If you want joint, you want a lollipop, you want a pill, you want a patch, you know, then you go on to um, the Canadian government has its own national pharmacy app. You go on that app, and then you can place your order. And within 48 hours, the Canadian Postal Service delivers that box to your door for your supply that you order for your charge to the veteran. Well, we heard about that, and we're like, well, that's just amazing. And of course, it is not the most perfect system. And we know that the United States government isn't, universally there yet. So we put our minds together and we thought along the lines of exactly what the clothing allowance was, because that's already existing and kind of gave us a framework of understanding to kind of build around. And the more we thought about it, the more we put it together, the more logical it sounded. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Michael Krawitz for his thoughts.
Appreciate it. Yeah, man. The the thing that we had to deal with was, like the I mean, it's so funny, the cannabis movement started out in the 1960s, kind of coming out of the hippie movement and utopia, seeking folks, and the anti-drug were these, straight people that were, too serious. And now we're kind of serious cannabis people, and the people that are against us are purely utopian with their anti-marijuana stuff. You really need to hear them. You really actually have to hear them to believe it. But we're dealing with reality, and the reality is that we've got a cannabis program in the United States that isn't going to change anytime soon, that gives the control of the medical cannabis programs to the state as in local state, like Georgia, Virginia, California. And the states have passed their own laws, and those laws are implemented, you know, at the state level, protected by our U.S. Constitution, separation of the powers in the state and the federal government. And the states also already handle a lot of medical stuff. Medical boards, medical licenses, a lot of that stuff are state run anyway. So, there are things that continue that aren't completely special for cannabis when it comes to states working on things that the federal government doesn't do. And the reality of it is that no matter what bill you're looking at in Congress, they really don't eliminate that program anytime soon. And we're trying to figure out how do we get veterans access to this cannabis in a way that does two things. One, gets the VA engaged in a positive way. So you have the cannabis actually integrated into the veterans' healthcare in a positive way that helps come up with better treatment options and treatment plans that improve the veteran's life, right? And then how do you do that you know in a way that is comfortable to the VA? Really, I talked about their oversensitivity to the DEA. So, and we looked at like DEA is right now talking about Schedule 3. And we looked at Schedule 3 and it doesn't do it for us because Schedule 3 still requires, in most cases, it's a very serious prescription drug. It's like, what was it? Schedule 3, has some uh, like Valium kind of drugs, right? Has ironically enough, it has Marinol, the THC pharmaceutical, is in Schedule 3. But
That's
that's
like
a pretty
Tylenol
serious
number three.
prescription.
It'd be
Tylenol
like
number 3 with codeine, yeah, with
the,
codeine. So
then
it's a
those are
fairly
four.
serious. Oh, that's even Schedule 4. That's not even Schedule 3. So yeah, Schedule 3 is more restrictive than that. And basically the bottom line being that Veterans Affairs doctors are used to writing Schedule 3 prescriptions. They're used to the fact that unlike Schedule 2 or Schedule 1, they can more liberally write refill prescriptions, for that kind of stuff. But they're still really, they're locked into understanding that as a prescription drug. And we looked at the schedules. I mean, right now, uh, it's really obvious to anybody who looks at anything the cannabis movement is doing to know that the cannabis movement wants cannabis to be removed from schedules, so-called descheduled. And that would definitely solve this problem. But we looked at the schedules as they're written, and Schedule 5 would actually work for now. If they wanted to reschedule and they rescheduled to 5 instead of 3, that would actually work for us because Schedule 5 includes, some fairly serious drugs, but not that serious that you can't prescribe them with a recommendation, and not so serious that you couldn't have them over the counter, so to speak, sold at the pharmacy just by signing your name without a prescription required. And if a prescription isn't required per se, then the Veterans Affairs doctor should feel a lot more comfortable writing the recommendation for it because the veteran is basically shopping on their own. They're getting guidance from the doctor. The doctor isn't really enabling them to get the cannabis. So that's what we looked at as a bridge. Schedule 5 seemed to work for us. Removing from scheduling, obviously, I think again is the way to go because it plant material primarily should have never been scheduled in the first place alongside very strong powder medicines, powder drugs like heroin. And then there's another problem. Um, the um, patient that needs something kind of special. I we're right now we're looking at kind of the future and transitioning to cannabis activism in the 21st century really now is when we're doing it really I'd say. And what I'm seeing is a need to protect and to work on what you might call craft cannabis or small farms of cannabis that produce what's called heirloom or landrace cannabis around the world. And what's going to happen is you're going to wind up with like, again, for lack of better words, like a corporate cannabis. That's going to actually be fine. Nothing wrong with corporate cannabis. We use a lot of corporate stuff. It fits most consumers' needs, including patients. And I'll say that it really does. Corporate cannabis or the legal cannabis, yeah, if it's coming from a source where it's trusted and you don't have pesticides and it's, well regulated, the patient's needs can be easily met for a lot of patients with again, sort of corporate cannabis. But there's going to be this odd patient or this odd application that's going to require something rather special, plant material that's only from a certain place or genetic, certain formulation, whatever, that's not going to be available from the pharmacy, not going to be available from the corporate world, I don't think, for a very long time, if ever. And I think that's where I'm focusing on now is the future of that, which is, I think, a problem above and beyond what schedule we put it on, or even if we deschedule it. And I just sort of wanted to insert it there in the end.
Mary Lynn, do you have any final thoughts? All right. Well, so again, we're looking at a concept of an idea. Mary Lynn, did you have any final thoughts before I wrap it up?
No. I think we spent a lot of time on this, and it's medicine. Descheduled be great. The voucher system is a great idea for the interim until they finally wake up. But again, anybody and everybody who's listening, the more you know about this, you know, Veterans Action Council does want to, as I said earlier, does want to know if you're running into problems or running into successes. It's nice to know what's working and where something's working and what issues are still happening around the country. That's about it.
All right, beautiful people. Well, I hope you got a thorough education after we have beat this horse into thorough glue. But we hope people will come back to this time and time again. Point your friends. When they come and ask, you can point to the sit rep video. You can point to the Veterans Action Council video. We can educate each other. You can take copies of your directive down to the VA. It's their own directive, and educate them on it. It is you're within your right. And if you feel that they're not educated, be the educator. That's what we've done, and we're not afraid to do it again. And yeah, any last final thoughts, Michael, before we close up this particular thoughts and ideas?
Just that I've taken, sort of this trip. When I started this, my little girl hadn't been born yet, and now she's, full on adult. Like, it's amazing how many years this whole, I told this story, but it unfolded over such a long period of time, and it's I really feel like this has been, some of the most rewarding time of my life is being connected to this stuff. Whether it be the internal work I'm talking about with the VA and the external work with the states or any of that. It's getting to know you all and getting to work with y'all and having to having an impact on the future. I told a lot of behind the scenes stuff that you'll read a little bit about it in Dr. Gephardt's journal article, but most of what I said tonight is very behind the scenes. That's why I wanted to take the time to give the detail, so it would be on the record somewhere. It's a really fascinating story, I think. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, at some time. But yeah, I appreciate getting to tell it and getting to hang out with y'all, and I really appreciate your input. Like, you guys have such an amazing, the three of us, the perspective that we bring to the table is quite awe-inspiring. I want to say that, the three of us in this call tonight. Um, so yeah, much love to y'all.
Well, and much love to
Better.
you. So as we close out this roundtable number 89, I want to thank each one of you, our veterans, allies, and providers, advocates, for showing up, as well as for listening and continuing to be part of this critical conversation. We unpacked the history of VHA Directive 1315, its evolution, its gaps, and its promise. We've heard lived experiences. We still walk that tightrope between healing and fear. We've laid out a vision from the VAC where safe, legal, compassionate access to cannabis is not a debate, but a basic right. So, to be clear, veterans shouldn't have to hide their medicine. They shouldn't have to choose between honesty and health care. And they definitely shouldn't be left behind while the rest of the country moves forward. We at the VAC are committed to protecting the right to heal, and we know you're with us. If you found a value in today's discussion, please share it, talk about it, and bring one more veteran into this conversation. All right, by doing so, this is how change happens. Roundtable by roundtable, story by story. Right. So we're not just talking policy; we're talking people. We're talking those who served our country and deserve honest, stigma-free health care. All right. All right. You can find more at our VAC's YouTube, of course. We appreciate your time, your voice, your continued fight to protect the right to heal. And set that back up. I'd like to thank Marilyn Mathry, Michael Krawitz, and myself, and the rest of the VAC members. This has been VAC Roundtable number 89, Veterans, Cannabis, VA Hospital, Know Your Rights under VHA Directive 1315. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. Oops.